Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Maria Simon. I'm a professor here at the Institute of International Relations at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and a research at the Global South Unit for Mediation, GSAM, a project of the BRICS Policy Center, our BPC, right? GSAM is devoted to the production and diffusion of knowledge and expertise on the broad spectrum of peace-related activities and conflict transformation mechanisms. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to PUC for this public discussion entitled An Evolving Global Order, BRICS, the Global South, and Humanitarian Imperatives. This event is organized by the BRICS Policy Center and the Institute of International Relations in partnership with the International Community of the Red Cross, CRC. Today, we'll have this incredible opportunity of listening to and engaging discussion with the Director General of the ICRC. Yeah, good. Okay, but that's the only I know. Yeah, okay. So, as we all know, we are living a moment marked by profound humanitarian challenges, with more than 130 armed conflicts currently going on worldwide. Alongside deepening geopolitical tensions and rivalries, the landscape in which humanitarian actors operate has become increasingly complex and complex. We have been witnessing not only the limits of humanitarian action, but also the erosion of respect for international humanitarian law and the normalization of violence against civilians, populations, and humanitarian workers. At the same time, we are also witnessing important shifts in global governance. Countries from the global south, including the BRICS countries, are playing an increasingly important role in shaping humanitarian response and international norms in this domain and in other domains. So this whole context makes today's discussion particularly relevant for us here in Brazil. So, as I said, it's truly an honor and a privilege to have Pierre with us. The ICRC, as we all know too, is one of the most important humanitarian organizations in the world, with a unique mandate to protect and assist victims of armed conflict and to promote and strengthen international humanitarian law. So Pierre is Director General of the International Committee of the Red Cross, position he assumed in April 2024. As head of the ICRC executive body, he is responsible for leading the Organization of Global Humanitarian Operations and its 18,000 staff members in over 100 countries, with an annual budget for more than $2.1 billion. So Pierre has dedicated more than 30 years to the humanitarian sector, including 25 years in senior positions at the ICRC, both in field delegation and at headquarters. His previous leadership roles at the ICRC include directors of operations between 2002 and 2014, and personal advisor to the ICRC president from 2000 to 2002. He also carried out several operational missions in El Salvador, Peru, Afghanistan, and Bosnia-Herzegovina from 91 to 98, for instance, and served as head of operations for Central and Southeast Europe, based in Geneva between 1998 and 2000. Immediately prior to assuming the role of ICRC Director General, Pierre served as Secretary of the ICRC Assembly. He also acted as the ICRC President's personal envoy to China and head of the regional delegation for East Asia between 2021 and 2022. In 2014, he was appointed Commissioner General and Under-Secretary General for the United Nations at UNRWA between 2014 and 2019. He holds a master's degree in political science and international relations from the University of Geneva and the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. But before I move to our very special guest, I'll pass the floor to Professor Gustavo Rubinstein, who will be speaking on behalf of our dean, Father Anderson Pedroso, and of the University. So please, Gustavo.
Thank you, Maria. First of all, welcome, yes. You're very welcome to PUC Rio and very welcome to Rio de Janeiro. Professor Maria, Professor Marta, dear guests, students, and colleagues, it's a great honor to represent the director of PUC Rio at the opening of this important event We are living, for sure, in a particularly challenging moment in contemporary history. The global order, as Maida just said, is undergoing significant transformation, marked by political tensions, armed conflicts, and large-scale humanitarian crises. In this context, the role of the Global South, and specifically BRICS countries, is becoming increasingly relevant in shaping new forms of cooperation, governance, and response to global challenges. For PUC-EU, as a community-based university committed to comprehensive education, knowledge production, and social impact, it is essential to actively engage in this debate. We really believe that the university must serve as a space for qualified dialogue, bridge building, and the development of solutions that connect academic knowledge, public policy, and real-world action. We are honored to welcome Pierre, whose leadership at the International Committee of the Red Cross reflects the complexity and urgency of humanitarian action in today's world. His presence brings invaluable insight connecting academia reflection with real-world humanitarian challenges. From the perspective of PUC-EU, we reaffirm our commitment to connecting academic production with strategic global agendas. We believe that topics such as humanitarian diplomacy, international cooperation, and sustainable development must be addressed in an integrated way, involving multiple stakeholders, academia, government, international organization, and civil society. Finally, I would like to highlight the importance of this event for our students and the young professionals, as I told Pierre. This is our main role and goal at this institution. Initiatives like this, expand our horizons, inspire career paths, and reinforce the transformative role of education. I wish you all an excellent event with productive discussion and meaningful reflections. Thank you very much. Obrigado, Pierre.
Obrigada, Gustavo. So, in fact, we're deeply grateful for your availability to discuss with our academic community. And I'm very happy to see this room full of students. I think several of them are first-year students, so I think it's an excellent and great opportunity for you. And we'll have time for debate, for discussion, provocative questions I will count. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Pierre. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And to you, Gustavo and Marta, thank you for this invitation. Greetings to all. Great pleasure and honor, actually, to be here at the BRICS Policy Center at your distinguished university. My colleagues from the delegation, the regional delegation here in Brazil, and some of my colleagues also from headquarters. It's very special, and we attach great importance to having this moment of exchange, because, as you said, the world is changing profoundly, and these types of conversations are extremely necessary. And let me start with just a few words about where the ICRC originated, in fact, how it came into being, and then look at some of the conflict-related trends that we're dealing with worldwide at the present in our work, to think about the theme that you highlighted, Mayra, which is the erosion of international humanitarian law and what to do about it, and then to think about what is the relationship between the ICRC and Brazil and the BRICS, also as an institution, as an expression of new forms of multilateralism and new forms of global governance. The ICRC was literally born on a battlefield. And what I mean by that is that in 1859, our founder was actually traveling through the north of Italy in search of business opportunities. He was not a humanitarian, neither was he a doctor. He was actually a business person looking for contacts. And he, at one point, stumbles across a battlefield in the north of Italy where confrontation had just taken place between forces from the Sardinian, French, and Austrian armies. And what he saw on the battlefield was 40,000 dead and injured, mostly soldiers. In fact, on that day, there was only one recorded civilian victim of that clash. But what struck him immediately was, additionally to the pain, the suffering, the cries and screams of the injured soldiers on the battlefield, but what struck him was that the armies that had assembled there had brought more veterinarians to treat horses that were there on the battlefield on that day than medical personnel to help the injured soldiers and officers. And what he did was two things that, when you think about them, are still in essence what the ICRC is today. He first acted on the ground. He could have been so shocked at what he saw that he would turn away and say, it's better I go back to Geneva. This is too shocking for me to deal with. But although he was neither a doctor, as I said, nor a humanitarian, he mobilized mostly women in neighboring villages to come and help those who were injured or dying, to bring some measure of relief. The second thing he did is that he decided that it was not enough to act just once, out of the spur of a reflex to say, I did something good, and then go back to his day-to-day job in Geneva looking for further business activities. He said, if this is what wars are about, if this is what wars really do to people, then I cannot leave it at an individual action. So he went back and worked to the development of what became the first Geneva Convention, which is the treaty that focused on improving the conditions of the wounded on the battlefield. And this back and forth between acting, responding, and influencing, mobilizing remains what you will see the ICRC do every single day, even to this very day. Now, of course, what has changed profoundly since the days that Henri Dunant appeared on that battlefield in Solferino is the means and methods of war. And maybe I just want to spend a few minutes describing what we're currently very much struck by. And one point, I already mentioned it, is the proliferation of armed conflicts. So we have today over around 130 armed conflicts worldwide, which is almost a doubling from the period of 2009. So it tells us that we are in a phase of history where what was said in the UN Charter, and what is still said in the UN Charter since 1945, that wars should be a last resort in resolving disputes and differences between states or other actors, is becoming again a very tolerated norm. So we are becoming very accustomed to seeing wars around. And not only are we seeing more and more conflicts, but they are also lasting on average for very long. Think of most of the conflicts that come to your mind today. I mean, you don't need to mention Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, 75 to 80 years. Colombia with 55 years of conflict. Since the ICRC has been present for 55 years in Colombia. The same, when it comes to countries like Syria, Yemen, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, even Ukraine, which of course we're focused now on the escalation of that conflict over the last 4 years, but in actual fact, it's been going on since 2014. And what does this tell us? So it says, first of all, one point about humanitarian work, and that is, we were not originally created as an organization to work for decades in the same conflicts. That was not the original idea. The original idea is there is a conflict starts, maybe you go for a few months, you go for a couple of years, and you help supporting populations that are impacted by that conflict. And then a negotiation takes place, the conflict is ended, and maybe as an organization, we move on to another place. Sadly, this is not our experience currently. There are very few conflicts that are negotiated to an end. There are also very, very few conflicts that end in decisive military victories. So this is something that people should remember when thinking about even initiating a war. Because it always at the beginning sounds like exactly the things that we have all read about related to World War One. People said in August of 1914, we'll be back home at Christmas. Well, they never were home at Christmas. It lasted for 4 full years with all the horrors and devastation that we are aware of. So this combination between wars that proliferate and wars that last for very long once they start is a major pressure and problem for the populations that are impacted, for states in managing global questions of peace and security, and for humanitarian organizations. And one thing that we are particularly struck by is that if wars don't or last for so long, it also tells us something, again, the point that Madame made, that we also highlighted, which is that we find ourselves in a time in history where we face a great weakness when it comes to conflict prevention and conflict resolution. And I must tell you, especially here in Brazil, where you are greatly attached to thinking around the resolution of conflicts and their prevention, finding peaceful avenues, negotiated paths. We can only, as a humanitarian organization, say, as we have said also in China and in South Africa, very clearly, and so here in the BRICS environment, I think that is relevant, we need new ideas. In ICRC, I will even tell you very sincerely, we are thirsty for new ideas when it comes to conflict prevention and conflict resolution. Because there has been an over-reliance on humanitarian work in the sense of crisis and conflict management. You can manage a conflict for decades, which is exactly what we are seeing these days, and an over-reliance. Now, I should advocate for humanitarian work, and I believe in it strongly, but I certainly don't believe in a paradigm where humanitarian work goes on for decades in the same country. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how we should be seeing the world. And it brings me to a point which I find in general as human beings, and I'll try to express it in the way as simple and clear as I can. I find us as human beings in general, as since I come from the West and in Europe, I would even emphasize it particularly strongly in the European context. I find human beings in general far too casual when it comes to the realities of war. And if you think, and I don't know how it is in your studies, but if I think back to my own studies, we all went through studying, as I said, World War I, World War II, and then of course we studied the wars of national liberation, decolonization, and many other forms of conflict. But in general, when I hear today in Europe again, politicians saying our young generation has to get ready for the same sacrifice as our grandparents had to show during World War II, I always find it very casual for people who have not had to face the direct consequences of the war to announce that yet another generation has to be prepared to pay the price. I would be more interested in politicians saying, because we as humans are all capable of inflicting extreme violence on other human beings, the antidote should be looked into. Better prevention of conflict, more belief in dialogue among nations, more creativity when it comes to resolving the dynamics of war. And so this leads me to say that what I often see, and what we are very struck by in ICRC, is a form of a trilogy where the first thing that we see very often is a form of glorification of war. In the narratives, and you can hear it a lot in the world today, it's starting again to explain that it's important to get prepared for war. It's important at times it's justified to go to war. And then what happens? The second stage is you have to dehumanize the other. If you think of the narratives that we're hearing these days, dehumanization is rampant in the world. And why are there the narratives of dehumanizing? Because in order to justify the attacks against someone else, you first have to reduce the other to a non-human. It makes the crimes that will be committed all the more easy to justify. And these are things that we really have to become better at. And of course, the third stage, so after glorifying the war and dehumanizing the other, when you dive into the abyss, and when the worst crimes have been committed again, we will all reemerge more wise and promise once again that it will never be happening again. And so this, I think, is so predictable in the human psyche. So look at some of the wars that we're dealing with in the recent years. All of us have followed. You have followed. We have colleagues who have worked in the heart of the Gaza Strip. If what happened in Gaza over the last 2.5 years is something that as human beings, beyond the politics, set aside for 1 second even one's political preferences, if that is what happened in Gaza, something that as human beings we are prepared to tolerate, then I'm very concerned about the future of humanity. It is just so catastrophic what has happened in human terms. And what has been the devastation for the people of Gaza, but also the physical destruction, the loss of life, the disappearance of loved ones. And that we can look at, of course, also now in the wider dynamics of the Middle East, with all of the succession of conflict, now in Iran, again in Lebanon, what has happened in Somalia, in Yemen, and others. It is the real cost of conflict. Now, might I say something important about the erosion of international humanitarian law? So maybe just a word about, you said also about international law in general, but let's focus now on international humanitarian law. And you're familiar with the fact those are rules that were adopted in order to limit the means and methods that parties in a conflict have when they fight against an enemy. So to be very practical, it concerns the respect for prisoners of war, of civilian internees, it's the protection of the civilian population. So these are rules that should be applied in times of war. Now, it will be interesting to hear from you how you relate to international humanitarian law. When I was a student, I didn't immediately find it as attractive as international human rights law, because international humanitarian law starts on the premise that wars happen. And certainly when I was at university, I found it more attractive to struggle against the very existence of war, because I found it something, the cost of it seemed so unbearable that to have to accept that wars happen, that violence will be used against civilians, was something that I was not comfortable with and that I found very challenging at a personal level. But the reality is that wars do happen. And we think in ICRC that it is very important that these rules exist, that protect people in times of conflict, that ensure that prisoners will be respected, that civilians can be protected. Now, the reason why I'm interested in your feedback later is because I can very well relate with the fact that one can become, first of all, disappointed, sometimes cynical about the fact that there is so little respect of these rules today. And that we've seen the pictures from Sudan to Ukraine to Gaza and elsewhere, the level of violations of these rules, this erosion, the deep questioning of the existence of these rules is something very disconcerting. Now, how did we respond to this? Well, first of all, we do not accept the narrative that these rules of international humanitarian law are no longer relevant. It's a narrative you hear a lot. We heard it already in the aftermath of the attacks on September 11, 2001, when the attacks took place in New York and in Washington, and then the United States carried out its military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a narrative in political circles and in academic circles, and partly also in the Western world, saying that, in fact, those who negotiated the Geneva Conventions in 1949, and this is a quote, had not anticipated a world with Al-Qaeda in it, or you can take any of the other new threats, or today you would say they hadn't anticipated a world with drones and new technologies and artificial intelligence, etc. Now, we have to remember that the negotiators of 1949 survived everything from the Holocaust to Hiroshima, Coventry and Dresden. So they knew pretty well what human beings are capable of inflicting on other human beings when there are no rules. And they negotiated these treaties precisely because they had lived through the war. So when you open the Geneva Conventions and you look at the articles that protect prisoners, that protect civilians, there's nothing theoretical. It's not, when you read those articles, always remember, they weren't drafted by humanitarian idealists that locked themselves in a room and thought about maybe one day in case. No, these rules exist because we have been to hell and some have survived it and many haven't. And so what is very important there is that we take a robust defense of those frameworks, because a world without rules is also a very dangerous place to go. And here I'd like to make a link with an initiative that we seized in 2024, which was the year of the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. And we felt the combination of 75 years of Geneva Conventions and the deep erosion, the troubling trends of lack of respect of these rules that we were witness of, and our teams in the field witness every single day, we said we have to seize an initiative. Something has to be done. And what we felt is we had to remobilize states and make them again fully not only empowered, accountable, but to galvanize political support for these rules. But we wanted to do it in a way that was a bit different from what we would have done in the past. Maybe in the past we would have sat down with Switzerland and a couple of other countries and thought about an idea. Here we designed it differently. As a recognition of the profound changes in global governance. And we wanted the launch of this initiative in New York in September 2024 to be together with 6 countries that would all of them represent the different continents on the planet, but especially also diverse multilateral realities. So we launched the initiative with Brazil, with China, with South Africa, with Kazakhstan, with Jordan, and with France. And the signal with this was to say, we are fully in recognition of the transforming global governance system, multilateral reality. But in particular, it was also a signal that the Geneva Conventions, which are the most widely ratified treaties that you find on the planet, are an expression not of the reality of one society and communicated or imposed on other societies, but something that is a commonly shared endeavor across communities and societies, across religions, which is the preservation of dignity of human beings in times of war. Because even if tomorrow we would withdraw the Geneva Conventions and say they no longer exist, we would find that in every one of our societies, every community has in its history at one point in a time of war written something about the need to preserve and respect prisoners, women and children, civilians, to spare them on the battlefield. You will find in every tradition on the planet. So in a sense, the Geneva Conventions encapsulate that. And I'm really deeply grateful to Brazil for its leadership on this initiative. It's essential to have seen the kind of investment that has been made from the Brazilian diplomatic network, but all the way up to the top leadership of the state on international humanitarian law. And the references and discourses about the increased number of conflict, the erosion of IHL, the importance of these rules, the importance to resolve conflicts, to prevent them, is all part of a very strong Brazilian narrative. And this is shaping a different way of thinking also in the ICRC. And when I think of the setting that we're here in, it's of course also related to BRICS. I had this personal experience of being, as I said, for 2 years, the head of the ICRC's regional delegation in Beijing from 2021 to 2023, and was also an immensely important learning phase, because as an organization, yes, we were born in Geneva, on the battlefield of Solferino, established in Geneva. But in the meantime, we have traveled many roads, many paths, we've sat at many different tables. And our message to you also is that we want to become better at hearing the perspectives from different parts of the world, in particular also from the global south. Because the future of humanitarian work is not one that will remain anchored in just a few places. You and other students in different countries across the world will be shaping humanitarian work differently in the future. And we are grateful and proud for the fact that we have opportunities like this today to exchange around these topics. Why do I say this also? Because many times you will hear, whether it's people in the United Nations, the ICRC or others, we will refer to the fact that these treaties that we are also based on, so in the ICRC case, the Geneva Conventions, in the UN's case, the UN Charter, of course, also the Refugee Convention or the Convention of Genocide or others, all of these treaties are from a short period in history from 1945 to 1951. We have to say, some of them were very dynamic thinkers. And we now need to be as dynamic in this time and age. We cannot surrender to the logics of polarization. We cannot surrender to the cynicism that says that it is naive to hope that we can prevent wars better. Because every time we hear that kind of a statement, we should remember the catastrophic consequences of war. The ICRC last year received a record number of requests in our archives in Geneva from families of people who have missing relatives from World Wars I and II. So think about what that means in terms of the number of years that some families will be with the uncertainty. And you know about the tragedy of missing persons in Brazil as well in your history. We know of the large number of missing persons in the conflict between the Ukrainians and the Russians today. We know about the large number of missing persons in Syria. Those tragedies do not end when the war stops. Those are tragedies that continue to be carried forward for generations. And so we really need new thinking. And so when you hear institutions like my own and others talking with a certain sense of nostalgia, as if there had been a golden age of respect of IHL and we were now in a different era, please, challenge us on this. Because to be very frank, we might also inadvertently be signaling that there was a time when we thought that the international order was a benign and benevolent one. We know that the international order that we have experienced over the last 80 years has also been deeply unjust, unequal, very much defective for many populations around the world. So we don't need to be nostalgic about the orders that created colonial rule. We don't need to be nostalgic about the order that created deep and profound injustices, unequal terms of trade between societies and others. But we need to not surrender to cynicism and pessimism. And your generation, like every generation, will now shape new ideas and different ways of thinking. And that is something the ICRC needs just as much as everybody else. So very, very pleased to be here today. Very happy to have this conversation with you. Look very much forward to your questions and comments. Let's go on to the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. I will have several questions, but I'm sure our students also have. Pierre told me that you can ask very provocative questions, as if too. I'm seeing Honor, Simone, so all invited to ask questions. And I think a point that caught my attention and we were talking about Brazil, and I remember about an experience we had here, a project financed by Canada. The name was HAZO, Humanitarian Action in Situations Other than War. And at the time, we were precisely discussing, Simone is here,